Before we begin tonight's journey, I want you to take a moment to settle in. Adjust your pillow if you need to. Pull the blankets up a little higher. Let the tension drain from your shoulders, your jaw, the small muscles around your eyes that work so hard all day. The world outside your window can wait. The worries you carried through the day can rest now, just as you are resting. Tonight, we are going somewhere quiet and far away. Somewhere the only urgency is the soft urgency of survival. The ancient human task of staying warm through a long winter night. If you enjoy these gentle journeys through history, consider subscribing to join our little community of night travelers. We gather here several times a week to explore the forgotten corners of the past, and there is always room for one more around the fire. Now, let me tell you about a family, not a tribe, not a nation, not the grand sweep of history that fills textbooks and museum exhibits. Tonight, I want you to meet 7 people whose names were never written in any official record, whose faces were never captured in any photograph, whose lives unfolded and ended on the vast northern plains without leaving any trace that historians can measure or catalog. And yet they lived, they loved, they struggled and persevered through a winter so brutal that it would be remembered in the oral traditions of their people for generations afterward. The winter of deep snow, some called it. The winter when the rivers died. The winter when survival itself became a daily act of courage, skill, and love. Their names, as I will call them tonight, were Gray Owl and Morning Star, husband and wife, both in their middle 30s. Both born into the Lakota people during the last years before everything would change forever. Gray Owl was a hunter of modest reputation, neither the greatest warrior in his band nor the poorest. He was known instead for his steadiness, his quiet reliability, the way he always returned from hunting trips with something, even when others came back empty-handed. Morning Star was respected among the women for her skill with hides, for the tightness of her seams, for the way her tipi covers shed rain and held warmth better than most. They had 3 children. Bright Leaf, their eldest, was 15 winters old that autumn, balanced on the threshold between girlhood and womanhood, already learning the skills she would need to keep her own family alive someday. Little Hawk was 9, old enough to help with real work, but young enough to still find wonder in the patterns of ice on the river and the tracks of rabbits in fresh snow. And then there was the baby, a girl not yet named in the formal way, still called simply Little One, as was the custom until a child survived their first year and received a name that would carry them through life. The 7th member of their household was Walks Slowly, Gray Owl's mother, a woman of perhaps 60 winters, whose body had begun to fail her, but whose mind remained sharp, and whose knowledge of the old ways ran deeper than the roots of the cottonwood trees along the river. She had survived more winters than anyone else in the band. She had seen the great herds when they still darkened the prairie from horizon to horizon. She remembered techniques and stories that even other elders had forgotten. These 7 souls, 3 generations bound together by blood and necessity, would face the coming winter in a single teepee 12 feet across. Their survival would depend on everything they knew, everything they had prepared, and perhaps most importantly, on each other. Picture yourself standing on the northern plains in late November of 1856. The grass has gone golden and brittle. stretching away in every direction until it meets a sky so vast it makes you dizzy to contemplate. The wind never stops here. It has been blowing since the beginning of the world, carrying the scent of distances you cannot imagine, of mountains and forests and frozen tundra far to the north where no human beings live. The band has made their winter camp in a bend of a river whose English name does not matter, in a place where cottonwood trees provide windbreak and fuel, where the bluffs to the north offer protection from the worst of the winter storms, where the water still runs clear and cold beneath the first skin of ice. 43 tipis cluster in this sheltered spot, home to perhaps 200 people who will spend the next 4 or 5 months in this place, waiting for spring. Gray Owl stands outside his family's lodge, watching the western horizon with troubled eyes. A wall of clouds has been building there since midday, a dark purple-gray mass that seems to swallow the setting sun. The temperature has been dropping all afternoon, and now, as the last light fades, his breath forms thick clouds that the wind tears away almost before they can form. He has seen many winters. He knows the signs. But something about this approaching storm unsettles him in ways he cannot quite articulate. The clouds are too dark. The pressure in his ears, that subtle sensation that comes before major weather changes, is more intense than he can remember feeling before. Even the horses, picketed in the sheltered area downstream, are restless, stamping and snorting, their breath making little fog signals in the gathering darkness. Inside the teepee, Morning Star is conducting her own assessment. She moves around the interior space with the efficiency of long practice, checking the lodge cover for any gaps where wind might penetrate, adjusting the inner lining that controls airflow, examining their fuel supply stacked neatly against the wall. Buffalo chips sorted by quality, the oldest and driest reserved for the coldest nights. Bundles of cottonwood branches, some green and some seasoned, each type serving different purposes in the complex art of fire management. A small, precious supply of hardwood, traded at considerable cost from bands who lived closer to the eastern forests, saved for true emergencies. Walks, slowly sits near the fire, the baby sleeping in her lap, watching her daughter-in-law's preparations with eyes that miss nothing. She has been uneasy for weeks, though she has said little. The geese flew south early this year, nearly a full moon before their usual departure. The buffalo that the hunters killed in autumn carried coats thicker than any she has seen in decades, as if the animals themselves knew what was coming and were preparing for something extraordinary. The wood walks slowly, says, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the enclosed space. We should bring more inside before the storm. Morning Star pauses, considering. The woodpile outside the teepee is substantial, the result of weeks of gathering and hauling. But walks slowly is right. Once the storm hits, venturing outside to retrieve fuel could be dangerous, even deadly. Better to crowd the interior space now than to face that risk later, she calls to Bright Leaf, who is helping Little Hawk with his evening meal. A thick stew of dried meat and prairie turnips that has been simmering most of the afternoon. Together, mother and daughter make several trips outside, carrying armloads of fuel into the teepee until the pile reaches nearly to the bottom of the lodge lining. The interior feels crowded now, cramped, in a way that would be uncomfortable in any other season. But comfort is a luxury that winter does not always permit. Gray Owl enters as they finish, brushing snow from his shoulders. The first flakes have begun to fall, fat and wet, the kind that often precede the dry, driving snow of a true blizzard. He meets Morning Star's eyes, and in that glance, a conversation passes between them that requires no words. They have been married for 16 winters. They have faced hard times before. They will face this together. The family settles into their evening routine, each person occupying their accustomed place in the teepee's careful geography. Gray Owl sits in the place of secondary honor to the left of the entrance, where a man should be ready to respond to any threat. Morning Star takes her position near the fire, where she can tend both the flames and the cooking. Walks slowly remains in her spot near the back, the warmest area, appropriate for an elder whose bones feel the cold more keenly than younger bodies. The children arrange themselves in the spaces between Little Hawk near his father, Bright Leaf near her mother. The baby passed between the women as needed. Outside, the wind begins to rise. The teepee walls flex and whisper, the lodge poles creaking softly as they absorb the pressure. Snow hisses against the buffalo hide like sand thrown by an angry hand. The temperature, already cold, continues to drop. Walks slowly begins to speak, her voice falling into the rhythms of old storytelling. A tale about the winter when she was a girl, about a storm that lasted 7 days, about the things her grandmother taught her during those long, dark hours when the world outside ceased to exist. The children listen with half attention, their eyes growing heavy, their bodies relaxing into the warmth of the fire and the comfort of family presence. Morning Star banks the fire for the night, arranging the coals in the pattern her mother taught her, the pattern her grandmother taught her mother. Knowledge passing down through generations like the most precious inheritance imaginable. She places the heating stones where they will radiate warmth toward the sleeping areas. She checks the smoke flaps one more time, adjusting them to account for the shifting wind. The family sleeps, pressed together beneath buffalo robes, their breath mingling in the darkness, their body heat combining with the carefully managed fire to create a small envelope of warmth in a world that has turned hostile and cold. Outside, the storm builds toward something none of them have ever experienced. But for now, for tonight, they are warm. They are together. They are home, and the winter has only just begun. The autumn of preparation. Let us step back now, before the storm, before the cold settled in to stay. Let us visit this family in the golden days of late autumn, when the work of survival was not yet desperate, but merely constant, when every task performed was an investment in the uncertain future, when the knowledge of generations flowed from old hands to young ones, like water finding its natural course. The moon that Europeans would call October hung low and orange over the prairie, and Morning Star woke each day before dawn to begin the work that would determine whether her family lived or died in the months ahead. This is the truth that comfortable modern life allows us to forget. For most of human history, survival was not guaranteed. It was earned day by day, through effort and skill and the accumulated wisdom of everyone who came before. Morning Star's first task each autumn morning was to assess the teepee cover that would shelter her family through winter. The cover they had used through summer was adequate for warm weather, but winter demanded something more. She needed heavier hides, tighter seams, a construction that could withstand winds that would tear lesser shelters apart, and cold that could kill the unprepared in hours. She had been working on the winter cover since late summer, when the buffalo hunts brought in the raw materials she needed. Selecting the right hides was itself a skill that took years to master. She needed hides from buffalo cows killed in late autumn, when their coats were thick but not yet heavy with winter growth that would make the leather too stiff to work. The hides had to be free of holes from arrows or battle damage. They had to come from healthy animals whose skin had not been weakened by parasites or disease. Bright Leaf worked beside her mother through these autumn days, learning the skills she would need when she had her own family to shelter. At 15, she was old enough to understand the weight of this knowledge, young enough to absorb it fully into her hands and memory. Morning Star taught without lecturing, demonstrating each technique and then guiding her daughter's hands until the motions became natural. "Feel here," Morning Star would say, pressing Bright Leaf's fingers against a section of hide. "This part is thinner. If we put it at the bottom where the wind hits hardest, it will wear through before spring. But here, higher up, it will be protected." The hide work was exhausting. Each skin had to be scraped clean of every trace of fat and flesh, a process that left hands raw and muscles aching. Then came the braining, rubbing a mixture of buffalo brain and bone marrow into the hide to make it soft and waterproof. This had to be done repeatedly over several days. The hide worked constantly to prevent it from stiffening, until finally it achieved the texture Morning Star was looking for. Soft enough to fold easily, but strong enough to resist tearing. The sewing required equal care. Morning Star used sinew thread, long tendons from buffalo legs that had been cleaned, dried, and split into strands finer than any thread European technology could produce. Her bone needles, handed down from her own mother, were worn smooth from years of use, their points still sharp enough to pierce multiple layers of hide. Every seam had to be tight and even. Water finding its way through a loose stitch could freeze and expand, making the hole larger, eventually compromising the entire structure. Walks slowly watched this work with eyes that missed nothing. Though her hands were too stiff now for the fine work of sewing, her knowledge remained invaluable. She could spot a weak seam from across the tipi, could predict which hides would wear well and which would fail, could remember techniques that even Morning Star had never learned. My grandmother used to add a strip of thicker hide along the bottom edge, Walks slowly mentioned one afternoon, her voice casual but her observation pointed. Where the cover meets the ground, where the snow piles up. It made the whole thing last longer. Morning Star paused, considering. She had not done this before, had not learned this particular technique from her own mother. But Walks Slowly's grandmother had survived winters that were legendary for their severity. If she had developed this method, there was reason for it. "Show me," Morning Star said, and Walks Slowly smiled the small smile of an elder whose knowledge is still valued, while the women worked on the shelter itself. Gray Owl and Little Hawk focused on fuel. This was men's work in the division of labor that governed Plains life, though the categories were not as rigid as later European observers would assume. The work was simply too important to be restricted by gender when survival was at stake. Buffalo chips were the primary fuel on the treeless plains, and gathering them was a task that Little Hawk had been helping with since he was old enough to walk reliably. He knew, as all plains children knew, that not all buffalo chips were equal. The freshest ones were too damp to burn well. The oldest ones, exposed to years of weather, had lost most of their fuel value. The best chips were those that had dried through one summer, but had not yet begun to disintegrate. Hard and dense and capable of burning for hours with a steady, even heat, Gray Owl taught his son to sort the chips by quality as they gathered them. The finest ones were reserved for the coldest nights when fuel efficiency was most critical. Medium quality chips would serve for everyday heating. Even the poorest chips were saved, useful for starting fires or extending the burn when better fuel was running low. Nothing is wasted, Gray Owl reminded Little Hawk as they worked, filling parfleche bags with the dried dung. Everything the buffalo gives us, we use. This is how we honor them. The cottonwood gathering was harder work and more dangerous. The trees grew along the river bottom, sometimes a mile or more from the winter campsite. Gray Owl made these trips alone or with other men from the band, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. Their horses laden with branches that would supplement the buffalo chip supply, that the wood served different purposes than the chips. Green cottonwood burned slowly with a smoky heat that was perfect for overnight fires. When the goal was sustained warmth rather than quick cooking heat, seasoned branches burned hotter and faster. Useful when food needed to be prepared quickly, or when a fire had burned too low and needed rebuilding. The balance between chip and wood, between slow burn and fast burn, between heat production and fuel conservation, was an equation that Morning Star solved anew each day based on temperature, wind, family activity, and dozens of other factors. Little Hawk was too young to fully understand these calculations, but he absorbed them nonetheless. He watched his mother tend the fire, noted which fuels she selected for different purposes, began to develop the intuitive understanding that would serve him when he had his own family to keep warm. Knowledge like this was not taught in formal lessons. It was breathed in, lived, accumulated through years of observation and gradual participation. The stone selection was perhaps the most mysterious aspect of winter preparation to outside observers. Gray Owl spent several autumn days along the riverbank, examining rocks with an attention that might have seemed obsessive to anyone who did not understand their purpose. He was looking for specific qualities, density and shape and composition, that would determine how well each stone absorbed and radiated heat. The best heating stones were smooth river rocks worn by centuries of water, their surfaces free of cracks that might cause them to shatter when heated. Gray Owl would hold each candidate in his hand, feeling its weight, sometimes striking it gently with another rock to hear its sound. A dull thud suggested internal fractures that could be dangerous. A clear ring indicated solid stone that would heat safely and evenly. He sorted his selections by size and type. Larger stones would be heated in the fire pit itself, radiating warmth throughout the night after the flames died down. Smaller stones could be wrapped in hide and placed directly against the bodies of the very young or very old. Personal heating devices that could prevent the kind of deep chill that killed the vulnerable Walks slowly had her own role in the autumn preparations. Though her body was failing, her memory held knowledge that no one else in the family possessed. She spent the shortening days organizing the family's stored food, calculating how much pemmican and dried meat and preserved berries would be needed to last, adjusting her estimates based on the signs she had been reading all autumn. "It will be hard," she told Gray Owl one evening, her voice low so the children would not hear. "The hardest I have seen since I was younger than Brightleaf. We need more food, more fuel, more of everything." Gray Owl nodded slowly. He had seen the same signs, had felt the same unease in his bones. He would hunt harder in the weeks remaining before deep winter set in. He would gather more fuel than usual, work longer days, push himself and Little Hawk to the limits of their endurance. Whether it would be enough, only time would tell. The moon grew thin and then swelled again. The nights grew longer. The temperature dropped, degree by degree, toward the threshold where water freezes and stays frozen until spring. And in their autumn camp, this family of 7 worked from dawn to darkness, preparing for a winter that none of them could fully imagine, trusting in the knowledge of their ancestors to carry them through whatever lay ahead. The first storm, if you are still with me, settling deeper into your pillow. Let us stay with this family a little longer. Let us enter the storm with them and feel what they felt. As much as words can convey the experience of wind and cold and the particular fear that comes when nature reveals how small and fragile human beings really are. The storm announced itself with a sound that morning Star had heard before, but never quite like this. It began as a low moan on the northern horizon, so faint at first that she thought she might be imagining it. But the sound grew, deepened, developed harmonics and overtones until it seemed less like wind and more like the voice of something vast and hungry approaching across the darkening prairie. She had just finished the evening meal, a thick stew that had filled every belly and left a comforting warmth spreading through the family. The children were drowsy, Brightleaf braiding her sister's few wisps of baby hair, Little Hawk practicing the knots his father had taught him on a length of sinew rope. Gray Owl was checking the teepee stakes, making sure each one was driven deep and secure into the frozen ground. Walks slowly sat near the fire, her eyes closed, but Morning Star knew she was not sleeping. The old woman was listening, reading the storm's approach in ways that younger ears could not quite match. "It will be bad," Walks slowly said quietly, confirming what Morning Star had already begun to suspect. The wind hit the camp like a physical blow. One moment, the teepee walls were gently flexing with the normal prairie breeze. The next, they were bowing inward, the lodge poles groaning under sudden pressure, the smoke flaps snapping and cracking like the wings of angry birds. The fire, carefully banked for the night, flared wildly as downdrafts forced air through the smoke hole, sending sparks swirling dangerously close to the stored fuel and sleeping robes. Morning Star moved without thinking, her body responding to years of training and experience. She adjusted the smoke flap poles, fighting the wind's resistance until the draft stabilized. She pulled the inner lining tighter at the bottom, closing the gaps where cold air was rushing in. She repositioned the heaviest fuel bundles against the door flap, adding weight to keep it from being torn open by the gusting wind. Gray Owl crawled to her side, his movements low and careful to avoid disrupting the precarious balance she was creating. Without words, they worked together, he reinforcing the stakes that held the cover down, she managing the internal airflow that kept them from suffocating in smoke or freezing in cold. They had done this before, many times, but never with wind that seemed actively malicious, that sought out every weakness in their shelter and exploited it. The children huddled together near the back of the teepee, Brightleaf holding her baby sister tight, Little Hawk pressed against her side, with eyes that were wide but not yet panicked. Walks slowly had not moved from her place by the fire. Her calmness was deliberate. Morning Star knew, a message to the children that there was no reason for fear, that the adults had everything under control. Whether that was true remained to be seen. The temperature inside the teepee dropped rapidly as the storm's full force struck them. Morning Star could see her breath now, could feel the cold pressing against her like a weight. She added fuel to the fire, larger pieces than she would normally use this early in the night, building the flames higher to combat the heat being stolen by the wind. The balance she had learned, the careful rationing of fuel through the long night hours, would have to be abandoned. Survival now trumped conservation for later. The sound was the hardest part. The wind did not merely blow. It screamed, howled, roared, with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It found frequencies that resonated with the human ear in deeply unsettling ways, sounds that triggered ancient instincts, the knowledge buried in every human body that small creatures caught in the open when such winds blew did not survive. Little Hawk began to cry, not loudly, not in panic, but with the quiet tears of a child who has encountered something too large to process. Gray Owl moved to his son's side, wrapping an arm around the boy's shoulders, murmuring reassurances that were barely audible over the storm's noise. "Tell me about the hunt," Gray Owl said, pitching his voice just loud enough for Little Hawk to hear. "Tell me about the rabbit you tracked last week. How did you find it?" The distraction worked. Little Hawk began to recount his small hunting success, his voice steadying as he focused on the memory. And Gray Owl listened with the kind of complete attention that made a child feel seen and valued. Brightleaf watched her father with new understanding, recognizing a parenting technique she would use herself someday. The way fear could be managed, not by denying it, but by redirecting attention toward competence and accomplishment. The first night of the storm passed in fragments of sleep and constant vigilance. Morning Star and Gray Owl took turns tending the fire, neither able to rest for more than an hour or two before the cold penetrating their sleeping robes woke them. The wind never let up, never gave them a moment of peace, just variations in intensity from merely terrible to genuinely terrifying. Dawn brought no relief, only a gradual lightening of the gray inside the teepee that indicated the sun had risen somewhere beyond the clouds of driving snow. Gray Owl tried to open the door flap and found it blocked by a drift that had built up overnight. He had to push through, gasping at the cold that hit him like a physical assault, just to confirm that the world outside still existed. What he saw was not reassuring. The storm had buried the lower portions of every teepee in the camp, creating white mounds that barely resembled the conical shelters they had been the day before. Visibility was measured in feet, not yards, the snow falling so thick and the wind blowing so hard that Gray Owl could barely see the nearest neighboring lodge. He retreated inside after less than a minute, his face already numb, his lungs aching from the effort of breathing air that seemed more ice crystal than oxygen. "We stay inside," he announced, though this was obvious to everyone. "We have enough fuel for 3 days, maybe 4 if we are careful. The storm cannot last that long." But even as he spoke, Morning Star saw the doubt in his eyes. This storm was not like others they had weathered. There was something relentless about it, something that suggested it might not obey the normal patterns of plains weather. The second day blurred into the third, time lost, meaning when there was no way to mark its passage. When day and night differed only in the degree of gray filtering through the smoke hole. When every hour was filled with the same tasks of fire tending and warmth seeking and waiting. Walks slowly came into her own during this confinement. With the family trapped and restless, she began to teach, sharing stories and knowledge that might otherwise have waited for more formal occasions. She taught Brightleaf a method for braiding sinew rope that would be stronger than the techniques the girl already knew. She taught Little Hawk the names of stars that he could not see, but would need to navigate by some day. She taught them all songs that her grandmother had sung during storms like this one. Songs whose words were partly prayer and partly defiance, asserting human presence against the overwhelming indifference of nature. On the third morning, the wind finally began to subside. The sound that had been their constant companion for more than 60 hours gradually diminished, dropping from a scream to a moan to a whisper to, at last, silence. The silence was almost as shocking as the storm had been. Morning Star found herself holding her breath, waiting for the wind to return, unable to quite believe that it had truly passed. Gray Owl opened the door flap to find a transformed world. Snow lay deeper than he had ever seen, drifted in places to the height of a mounted rider, covering the landscape in white that glittered painfully bright under the emerging sun. The temperature had dropped further during the storm's passage, cold enough now that exposed skin would begin to freeze in minutes, but they had survived. The teepee had held. The fire had burned through the darkest hours. The family was whole and healthy and alive. Morning Star took stock of their fuel supply and felt the first real fear of the season. 3 days of constant fire burning had consumed nearly half of what she had planned to last through the entire winter. The storm was over, but winter had barely begun. She said nothing to the children. She said nothing even to Gray Owl, though she knew he could read the concern in her face. They would simply have to work harder, gather more, prepare better for the next storm, because there would be more storms. Winter on the northern plains was not a single battle but a long campaign, and this first engagement, though survived, had shown them just how formidable their enemy could be. The weeks between that first storm and the deep freeze of January passed in a rhythm that was exhausting but manageable. More storms came, though none as severe as that first one. Gray Owl ranged farther and farther from camp in search of fuel, sometimes traveling half a day to find cottonwood stands that had not already been stripped by others. Morning Star stretched their food supplies with the skill of someone who understood that hunger in February was preferable to starvation in March, but January brought something different. Not a storm this time, but a cold so profound that it seemed to have substance. to have weight, to press down on the world like a physical force. The elders called it the iron, cold, and Morning Star understood why. She woke on the first morning of its arrival to find that the water in their cooking vessel had frozen solid. Despite being kept within arm's reach of the fire, she had never experienced cold like this. No one in the camp had, except perhaps Walks slowly, whose memories stretched back to winters that younger people knew only as stories. The temperature, if anyone had possessed instruments to measure it, had dropped to more than 40 degrees below zero. At such temperatures, the rules of normal life simply ceased to apply. The first thing Morning Star noticed was the silence. Cold, this intense, killed sound, damped vibrations, created a stillness that was almost supernatural. The constant background noise of camp life, children playing, dogs barking, people calling to each other, all of it disappeared. The only sounds were the crackle of fire and the occasional sharp crack of trees splitting as the moisture in their trunks froze and expanded. The second thing she noticed was the frost forming on the inside walls of the teepee. Despite the fire burning as high as she dared, despite the body heat of 7 people, despite every technique she knew for retaining warmth, ice crystals grew on the buffalo hide walls, white feathers of frozen moisture that glittered in the firelight. The teepee was losing its battle against the cold. Morning Star responded with everything she had learned. She lowered the inner lining to trap more warm air in the living space, accepting the increased smoke in exchange for better heat retention. She heated stones until they glowed and positioned them around the sleeping areas. She kept the stew pot simmering constantly, the steam adding moisture that helped their lungs cope with air so dry it hurt to breathe. Gray Owl's daily fuel gathering trips became ordeals of endurance. He would leave bundled in every piece of clothing he owned, his face wrapped until only his eyes were exposed, his hands double-mittened with fur-lined hide. Even so, he could only stay outside for short periods before the cold began to penetrate his protection. Before his fingers started to numb and his face began to burn with the early signs of frostbite. The trips took longer because he had to move carefully, conserving energy, rationing his body heat as carefully as Morning Star rationed their fuel. Running would warm him temporarily, but would also cause him to sweat. And sweat in this cold could be fatal, freezing against the skin, stealing heat faster than the body could replace it. So he walked steadily, methodically, stopping to rest in whatever shelter he could find, always calculating the balance between the fuel he might gather and the danger of staying out too long. Little Hawk wanted desperately to help his father, but Gray Owl refused to take the boy on these trips. The margin for error in such cold was too small. An adult man who made a mistake might survive to learn from it. A child who made the same mistake probably would not. So Little Hawk helped in other ways. He tended the fire while his mother rested, learning the subtle signs that indicated when more fuel was needed. When the flames were burning too high and wasting precious resources, he helped Brightleaf care for the baby, holding his infant cousin close to share body heat, singing the soft songs that kept her calm during the long, cold hours. He listened to Walk's slowly stories with new attention, understanding now that the old woman's knowledge was not just entertainment, but survival information, techniques and wisdom that might save his life someday. The baby was everyone's constant concern. Infants are particularly vulnerable to cold, their small bodies losing heat faster than they can produce it, their inability to communicate discomfort making it hard to know when they are in danger. Morning Star and Walks slowly worked in concert to keep the little one warm, passing her between them throughout the day and night, ensuring she was always held against someone's body, always wrapped in the warmest robes, always protected from the cold that killed the careless. Walks slowly taught them all the signs of dangerous chilling in infants: the pale, mottled skin, the weak, mewing cry, the lethargy that came as the body began to shut down. She had seen babies die from cold in winters past, and she was determined that this little one would not join them. One night during the deepest part of the cold snap, the family woke to find that the fire had burned too low. Morning Star had misjudged the fuel load, or perhaps the cold had simply consumed heat faster than anyone anticipated. The temperature inside the teepee had dropped to the point where breath formed thick clouds, where the water in the cooking vessel was beginning to freeze again, where the baby was crying with a thin, weak sound that spoke of dangerous chilling. What followed was a demonstration of skill under pressure that Morning Star would remember for the rest of her life. Gray Owl was rebuilding the fire, his movements fast but controlled, his frozen fingers fumbling with the fuel but finding their task through sheer determination. Walks slowly had the baby pressed against her chest, skin to skin beneath her robe, using her body heat to warm the infant even as she murmured prayers to the spirits who protected children. Bright Leaf was heating stones in the coals of the dying fire, preparing the additional heat sources they would need once the flames were restored. Little Hawk stood ready with more fuel, waiting to pass it to his father as needed. They worked as a unit, without discussion, each person knowing their role and performing it without hesitation. The fire caught and grew. The stones heated and were positioned. The baby's cries grew stronger as warmth returned to her small body. Crisis passed into relief, and relief into the exhausted sleep of people who have faced death and turned it away. Morning Star did not sleep that night. She sat by the fire, tending it with obsessive attention, feeding it fuel at careful intervals, watching the flames as if they were the only thing keeping the darkness at bay, which, in a very real sense, they were. She thought about her mother during that long vigil, about the winters they had shared when Morning Star was a child, about the techniques and stories and songs that had been passed to her, along with the more tangible inheritances of needles and robes and teepee covers. She thought about Bright Leaf, watching and learning beside her, and about the baby, who might someday sit where Morning Star sat now, keeping her own family warm through a difficult night. The knowledge was the real inheritance, she realized. Not the things, but the knowing, the understanding of how to survive, how to work with the forces that could destroy you, how to find warmth in the coldest places. This was what they passed from generation to generation, more valuable than any possession, more lasting than any structure. The iron cold held for 12 days before finally breaking. When the temperature rose back to merely brutal, it felt almost warm by comparison. Morning Star emerged from the teepee that first moderate morning and stood blinking in the winter sunlight, feeling the wind on her face without the immediate bite, breathing air that did not hurt her lungs, They had survived the worst of it. Her family was intact, healthy, perhaps even stronger for having come through together. The fuel supply was lower than she would have liked, but Gray Owl was already planning longer, gathering trips to replenish it. The food would stretch if they were careful. Spring was still months away, but it no longer seemed impossibly distant. That night, as she banked the fire and settled her family for sleep, Morning Star allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had kept them warm through the worst cold of her life. She had proven herself equal to the challenge that winter represented. She did not know that the greatest challenge was still coming. The accident happened on a day that seemed, by the standards of that terrible winter, almost mild. The temperature had risen to something merely uncomfortable. The wind had dropped to a manageable breeze, and Gray Owl had set out for a cottonwood stand several miles upstream that he had been wanting to reach for weeks. The conditions were as good as they were likely to get, and the family's fuel supply, depleted by the long cold snap, desperately needed replenishment. He took the strongest of their horses, a sturdy mare who had carried him through many winters, and he promised Morning Star he would return before dark. She watched him go with the mixture of worry and acceptance that was every plains wife's companion when her husband ventured out in winter. There was always risk. The only alternative to risk was sitting in the teepee and watching the fuel pile shrink to nothing. The day passed quietly. Morning Star worked on mending a tear in the teepee lining, her fingers moving with practiced precision even as her mind wandered to her husband somewhere out on the frozen prairie. Brightleaf continued the hide work that was her constant winter occupation, preparing skins that would become next year's shelter and clothing. Little Hawk practiced shooting with a small bow, sending blunted arrows at a target made from stuffed hides, building the skills he would need when he was old enough to hunt real game. Walks slowly sat with the baby, singing songs that were older than anyone could remember. When dark began to fall and Gray Owl had not returned, Morning Star felt the first real stab of fear. He was never late. In all their winters together, he had never failed to return when he said he would. Something was wrong. She stood at the teepee entrance, staring out at the gathering darkness, straining to see movement on the white expanse of snow. The other families in the camp were settling in for the night, smoke rising from 40-some teepees, the normal sounds of evening routines. No one else seemed concerned. Why should they be? Hunters sometimes returned late. It was not unusual. But Morning Star knew her husband. She knew the precise nature of his promises and the reliability of his word. If he said he would return before dark, only something serious would prevent him. The horse, a dark shape moving against the snow, walking slowly with the gait of an animal that was exhausted but determined, and on the horse's back, slumped forward, barely holding on, was Gray Owl. Morning Star was running before she fully registered what she was seeing. The snow grabbed at her feet, tried to slow her down, but she pushed through it with strength born of fear. She reached the horse just as Gray Owl began to slide from the saddle, catching him, feeling his weight fall against her, smelling the sharp scent of river water frozen into his clothing. "The ice," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The ice broke. He had fallen through while crossing a stretch of river he had crossed safely dozens of times before. The ice had looked solid, had felt solid under the horse's hooves, until suddenly it wasn't. The horse had scrambled free. Gray Owl had managed to pull himself out, but not before the frigid water had soaked him to the waist, had begun the deadly process of stealing the heat from his core. The ride back to camp had been a battle against the cold that was killing him from the inside out. Only his determination, his knowledge that his family was waiting, his absolute refusal to die in the snow like a wounded animal, had kept him conscious long enough to reach home. Morning Star got him inside the teepee with help from Brightleaf, who had seen them coming and was already preparing the space. They stripped off his frozen clothing, the fabric stiff as boards, cracking as they forced it from his body. They wrapped him in every warm robe they had, positioned heated stones against his core, piled more fuel on the fire until the teepee was almost unbearably hot. But the damage was done. By morning, Gray Owl was burning with fever, his body's response to the trauma it had suffered. He coughed constantly, deep, racking coughs that came from somewhere in his chest and brought up fluid that frightened Morning Star with its color and quantity. His skin was hot to the touch, but he shivered uncontrollably. His body caught in contradictions it could not resolve. Walks slowly recognized the sickness. She had seen it before, in winters past, when people who had been exposed to extreme cold developed ailments that attacked the lungs. Some recovered, some did not. There was no way to know in advance which way the spirit would choose to go. Morning Star faced a new reality. Her husband, who had always been the one to venture out and gather fuel, who had shouldered the physical burdens that made their survival possible, was now another person who needed care. The fuel supply, already depleted, would continue to shrink unless someone replaced Gray Owl's labor. The family's survival now rested on her shoulders, and hers alone. No, not alone. Brightleaf was there, standing beside her mother, her face showing fear, but also determination. She was 15, old enough to work, old enough to understand what needed to be done. "I can help," Brightleaf said. "Tell me what to do." And so the roles shifted. Morning Star took over the fuel gathering, making shorter trips than Gray Owl had made, staying closer to camp but going out more frequently. Brightleaf assumed her mother's responsibilities inside the teepee, tending the fire, preparing food, helping Walks slowly care for Gray Owl and the baby. Little Hawk, too young for the hardest work, did everything a 9-year-old could do, carrying fuel from the pile to the fire, fetching snow to melt for water, running errands between their teepee and the neighbors who offered help. The neighbors did help as much as they could. Other women brought food, stew from their own pots, pemmican from their own stores, the generosity of community asserting itself in crisis. Men from other families offered to gather fuel, though their own families' needs limited how much they could share. The chief's wife came personally to check on Gray Owl, bringing herbs that might help with the fever, offering prayers for his recovery. But ultimately, the family's survival depended on its own members, on the knowledge and strength and determination that Morning Star had been building her entire life. She discovered reserves she had not known she possessed. Muscles that screamed with exhaustion found ways to keep working. A mind that wanted to collapse into despair found focus instead, channeling worry into action, fear into productivity. She came back from each fuel-gathering trip more tired than she had ever been, but she came back with fuel, and she went out again the next day. And the day after that. The hardest part was watching Gray Owl struggle. He was not a man who accepted helplessness. He tried to get up, tried to resume his duties, and had to be convinced, sometimes forcibly, to stay under the robes and let his body heal. The coughing fits left him gasping and weak, his face gray with exhaustion, his eyes showing a fear he would never have admitted to his children. At night, when the family slept, Morning Star would sometimes sit beside her husband and simply hold his hand. No words were necessary. They had been together for 16 winters. They had built this family together, created this life together, survived countless challenges together. They would survive this one, too. They had to. The fuel supply dwindled, despite Morning Star's efforts. She was gathering less than Gray Owl had gathered, constrained by her shorter range and the need to spend more time in camp managing everything else. A choice was coming. She could see it approaching like another storm on the horizon. They could burn their reserves freely, betting everything on Gray Owl's quick recovery. Or they could ration carefully and risk the fire burning too low during the coldest nights. She chose to burn. There would be no point in saving fuel if her family froze while waiting to use it. Better to be warm now and face the future's problems when they arrived. It was the right choice. It was the only choice. But it meant that when the future arrived, when Gray Owl's recovery stretched from days into weeks, the situation became truly desperate. Morning Star had never been so tired, so afraid, so utterly responsible for so many lives. And the winter was not over yet. The night that nearly ended them came in early February, when the moon was a thin sliver and the stars burned cold and hard above the frozen prairie. Gray Owl's fever had persisted for nearly 3 weeks, draining his strength, leaving him a shadow of the man who had ridden out so confidently on that mild day. The fuel supply had shrunk to almost nothing. A small pile of buffalo chips and a few cottonwood branches that Morning Star rationed as carefully as food. The temperature had been dropping all day, and by nightfall, the cold had returned to nearly the intensity of January's worst. Morning Star felt it as she banked the fire for the night, felt it in the way the flames seemed to shrink despite adequate fuel, felt it in the frost forming on the inside of the teepee walls before full darkness had even arrived. She knew they did not have enough fuel to maintain proper heat through the night. She had known it for days, had been stretching what they had far beyond reasonable limits, hoping that something would change, that Gray Owl would recover, or the weather would moderate, or help would come from somewhere. But nothing had changed, and now she faced the reality she had been avoiding. They might not survive until morning. Morning Star made her preparations with the calm of someone who has moved beyond panic into a kind of clear-headed acceptance. She positioned the sleeping robes to maximize shared warmth, arranging her children and mother-in-law and husband into a configuration that would allow body heat to circulate between them all. She heated the last of the good stones, placing them strategically where they would provide the most benefit for the longest time. She built the fire as high as she dared, knowing it would burn down to coals long before dawn, but wanting to start the night with as much heat as possible. Brightleaf helped without needing direction, her movements mirroring her mother's, her young face showing the same terrible awareness. She had become an adult during these weeks of crisis. The responsibilities forced upon her, stripping away the last vestiges of childhood. Morning Star looked at her daughter and saw the woman she would become, strong and capable and resilient, and felt a fierce pride alongside the fear. "We will make it," Brightleaf said, her voice steady. "We have to make it." Little Hawk was quieter than usual, sensing the tension without fully understanding it. He stayed close to his father, sharing body heat with the sick man, watching the fire with eyes that were too old for his 9 winters. The baby slept in Walk's Slowly's arms, oblivious to the danger, dreaming whatever dreams infants dream. Gray Owl tried to rise when he understood what was happening. "I can help," he said, the words interrupted by coughs. "I can gather more fuel. I can." "You will stay warm and heal," Morning Star told him, her voice gentle but final. "That is how you help. That is what we need from you." He subsided, too weak to argue, his eyes showing the anguish of a man watching his family struggle while he lies helpless. Morning Star kissed his forehead, tasting the salt of fever sweat, and then she turned to face the night. The first few hours were manageable. The fire burned well, the stones radiated their heat, the family huddled together under the robes and shared warmth. Morning Star sat apart, tending the flames, feeding in chips one at a time, extending their fuel supply as long as physically possible. Walks Slowly began to sing. Her voice was thin with age, but the song itself was ancient. Words in the old language that Morning Star did not fully understand but recognized from her childhood. It was a prayer song, a plea to the spirits who controlled weather and fire and survival. Whether anyone was listening, Morning Star could not say, but the song helped. It filled the teepee with something besides the sound of wind and cold, gave them all something to focus on besides their fear. Midnight came and went. The fire had burned down to coals, glowing red in the darkness, providing less heat with each passing hour. Morning Star added the last of the fuel, watching the chips catch and burn, knowing they would last perhaps 2 more hours before there was nothing left. She had done everything she could. The rest was out of her hands. The cold crept in gradually, insidiously, finding gaps in the robes, penetrating the weakened defenses of the teepee. Morning Star felt it first in her feet, then in her hands, then in the core of her body where heat was most critical. She moved closer to her family, adding her body warmth to theirs, becoming part of the human furnace they had created. The baby woke and began to cry. It was a weak cry, the sound of an infant who was cold and uncomfortable but not yet in danger. Walks Slowly shifted her position, tucking the baby closer, beginning to rock gently while maintaining the prayer song that had continued all night. "She needs milk," Walks Slowly said quietly. "She needs warmth and milk." Morning Star had been nursing the baby as a supplement to her own milk-poor supply, her body stressed by exhaustion and inadequate food. She opened her robe now, took the infant against her skin, felt the cold little body begin to warm as she offered what nourishment she could. Brightleaf pressed closer on one side, Little Hawk on the other. Gray Owl, fevered and weak, added what heat he could from behind her. Walks Slowly completed the circle. The old woman's body temperature lower than the others, but still contributing to the collective warmth. The fire died to embers. The embers faded to ash. The only heat left in the teepee was what they were generating with their bodies. 7 people pressed together so tightly they breathed the same air, shared the same warmth, faced the same fate. Morning Star began to doubt. She had been so sure they would make it, so determined to keep her family alive through whatever the winter could bring. But the cold was relentless, patient, eternal. It had been here before the first humans walked the plains and would be here long after the last of them were gone. What arrogance to think they could defy it, these small, fragile creatures with their thin hides and their tiny fires. And then Walks slowly did something unexpected. The old woman, frail and exhausted, sat up in the darkness. Her voice, which had been barely a whisper, suddenly gained strength. The prayer song changed, became something fiercer, more demanding. She was not asking the spirits for help anymore. She was telling them that her family would survive. She was asserting the human will against the indifferent cold, claiming their right to life with every word. Morning Star felt something shift, not in the temperature, which remained brutal, but in herself. The doubt that had been creeping in retreated. The fear that had been growing subsided. She looked at her daughter, her son, her husband, her baby, her mother. These were her people. This was her family. She would not let them die. She began to sing along with Walks slowly, her voice joining the old woman's, adding strength to the prayer that was also a promise. Bright Leaf joined in, then Little Hawk, their young voices weaving together with the older ones. Even Gray Owl, coughing and weak, added what sounds he could, his determination unbroken despite his body's failure. They sang through the darkest hours. They sang until their voices grew hoarse and their breath came in visible clouds. They sang not because they believed the spirits were listening, but because singing was doing something, and doing something was better than waiting to freeze. Dawn came the way it always does, slowly at first, a gradual lightening of the darkness that crept in through the smoke hole and spread across the teepee walls. The frost that had formed during the night glittered in the pale light, beautiful and deadly. The fire pit held nothing but cold ash. The family lay huddled together, alive. Morning Star rose first, her joints stiff, her body aching, but alive. She looked at her family, counting them, confirming that each one had made it through. Gray Owl's breathing was easier than it had been in weeks, his fever finally breaking. Bright Leaf's eyes opened, showing exhaustion but also triumph. Little Hawk slept deeply, the sleep of a child who has been through too much but has emerged intact. Walks slowly still held the baby, both of them breathing the steady breath of survivors. The baby stirred, made a small sound, and began to nurse. They had made it through the longest night, through the coldest hours, through the moment when everything seemed lost. They had made it together. Morning Star walked to the teepee entrance and pulled back the flap. The world outside was white and cold and beautiful. The sun was rising, painting the snow with shades of pink and gold. Smoke was beginning to rise from other teepees as other families woke to face another day, and somewhere, not too far away, she could hear the sound of a neighbor approaching with an armload of firewood. Help came that morning in ways Morning Star had not dared to hope for. The neighbor who arrived with firewood was just the first. Word had spread through the camp about the family's desperate night, carried by the subtle communication networks that connected every teepee to every other. By mid-morning, a small pile of fuel had accumulated outside their lodge. Contributions from families who had a little to spare and wanted to help. the chief himself came to visit, bringing not just fuel, but food, pemmican, and dried meat from his own stores, enough to ease the hunger that had been gnawing at the family for weeks. He sat with Gray Owl for a time, speaking quietly about the coming spring, about hunts that would be organized, about the band's plans for the warmer months. It was the kind of conversation between men that acknowledged Gray Owl's place in the community, reminded him that he was still valued, still needed, still a person whose recovery mattered beyond his immediate family. Gray Owl's fever broke fully that day, his body finally winning its long battle against the sickness in his lungs. He remained weak, would remain weak for many weeks yet, but the coughing eased and his appetite returned, and the color came back to his face. Morning Star watched him eat a bowl of stew, saw the way his hands shook from exhaustion, but gripped the bowl firmly, and allowed herself to believe that he would truly recover. The relief was so profound. She had been running on determination and fear for so long that she had forgotten what hope felt like. Now it came flooding back, almost overwhelming in its intensity. She stepped outside the teepee, away from her family, and stood in the cold winter sunshine and cried. Brightleaf found her there a few minutes later. The girl said nothing, just stood beside her mother and put an arm around her waist. They stood together, mother and daughter, watching the camp go about its daily business. The normal routines of winter survival that seemed almost miraculous after the crisis they had endured. "I was scared," Brightleaf said, finally. "I thought we were going to die." "I know," Morning Star replied. "I was scared too, but we didn't die." "No, we didn't." Brightleaf was quiet for a moment, processing. "Because of what you did. Because of what grandmother did. Because we all did what we needed to do." Morning Star considered this. It was true, but it was also incomplete. They had survived because of knowledge, skill, determination, cooperation, love. They had survived because they were part of a community that came to help when help was needed. They had survived because their ancestors had figured out how to live in this harsh place and had passed that knowledge down through countless generations. We survived because we are not alone, Morning Star said. We have each other. We have our people. We have everything that everyone who came before us learned about how to live. Brightleaf nodded slowly, understanding. She had grown up during this winter, had crossed the threshold from child to adult in the crucible of crisis. The knowledge she had gained, the skills she had developed, the strength she had discovered in herself, these would serve her for the rest of her life. The remaining weeks of winter passed without major incident. The weather moderated, never quite warm, but no longer trying actively to kill them. The fuel supply stabilized as Gray Owl slowly resumed light duties, as community support continued. As the days grew longer and the worst of the cold began its gradual retreat, Little Hawk changed to during these weeks. The boy who had cried during the first storm now approached each day with a seriousness beyond his years. He took on more responsibilities without being asked, helped his father without complaint, watched his mother and sister with eyes that missed nothing. The winter had marked him, as it marks everyone who survives something difficult. He would never forget what he had learned about himself and his family during those long, cold months. Walks slowly grew quieter as winter began to break, spending more time in contemplation. conserving the energy that had burned so bright during the longest night. She was tired in ways that rest would not fix, worn down by decades of winters, sustained now mainly by her determination to see one more spring. Morning Star watched her mother-in-law with concern and tenderness, ensuring she had the warmest spot by the fire, the softest robes, the best portions of food. "You saved us," Morning Star told her one evening. That night, when everything was darkest, "Your singing, your prayers, you saved us." Walks slowly smiled, the small smile of an old woman who has lived long enough to understand how life really works. We saved each other. That is what families do. That is what people do, if they are wise enough to remember it. The baby grew stronger as winter loosened its grip. Her cries became louder, more demanding, the cries of a healthy infant who expected the world to respond to her needs. She had survived her first winter, had passed the test that claimed so many young lives in those difficult months. Soon she would receive her formal name, the name she would carry through life, marking her as a person who had proven she belonged in this world. Morning Star began to think about that name, about what it should convey. She wanted something that would honor the winter they had survived, the strength they had discovered, the love that had carried them through. She wanted something that would remind this girl, as she grew, of where she came from and what her family had endured to give her life. One morning in late February, Morning Star woke to a sound she had almost forgotten. Water dripping. The snow on the teepee walls was beginning to melt in the growing warmth of the sun. The temperature was still cold by any reasonable standard, but it was warm enough for melting, warm enough to signal that the worst was truly over. She stepped outside to watch the sunrise, something she had rarely done during the darkest months, when every moment of warmth was precious and not to be wasted on sentiment. The light spread across the snow-covered prairie, painting the world in shades of gold and pink, revealing a landscape that was tired and worn but still beautiful, still alive, still waiting for the renewal that spring would bring. Gray Owl joined her, moving slowly, leaning on a walking stick he had carved during his weeks of convalescence. He stood beside his wife and watched the sun rise, and neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. They had survived. They were together. Spring was coming behind them inside the teepee. They could hear Walks slowly beginning the morning prayers, her thin voice carrying the ancient words that connected this day to all the days that had come before. Brightleaf was tending the fire, the sound of her movements efficient and confident. Little Hawk was playing with the baby, making her laugh with funny faces and sounds. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. Extraordinary miracle. The winter had taken things from them, strength and comfort, but it had given them things too, knowledge of their own resilience, bonds strengthened by shared struggle, the deep satisfaction of having faced the worst and survived. These gifts were not tangible, could not be stored in parfleche bags or counted like buffalo chips, but they were real. Perhaps the most real things any of them possessed. Morning Star thought about all the families across the plains who were waking to this same sunrise, who had fought their own battles against the same winter, who had lost some members and saved others and emerged changed by the experience. She thought about the generations who had come before, who had faced winters just as hard and had found ways to survive and pass on their knowledge. She thought about the generations yet to come, who would face their own winters and would need every scrap of wisdom the present could provide. The knowledge had to be passed on. That was the duty of everyone who survived, to ensure that what they had learned did not die with them. Morning Star would teach Brightleaf everything she knew, and Brightleaf would teach her own daughters someday, and the chain would continue unbroken as long as the people endured. "It's going to be a good day," Gray Owl said finally, his voice still rough from weeks of coughing, but stronger than it had been. Morning Star leaned against him, feeling his warmth, feeling the solid reality of his presence beside her. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." They stood together and watched the sun climb higher, bringing warmth and light to a world that had been dark and cold for so long. The winter was not quite over, but its power was broken. They had survived the worst of it, and spring, patient and inevitable, was finally on its way. As the story of this one family settles into the quiet spaces between sleeping and waking, let me stay with you a little longer. The fire is burning low now, the last of tonight's journey fading into comfortable darkness. But before you drift away completely, there are a few thoughts I would like to share. Some reflections on what we have witnessed together during this long winter night. The family we followed, Gray Owl and Morning Star and their children, walks slowly with her ancient knowledge, and the baby who survived her first winter. They are real in the way that all families are real, who face impossible situations and find ways through them. Their names may not have been precisely what I called them. The details of their story may have differed in small ways from what I described, but people like them lived and struggled and survived in that place, in that time, in that brutal intersection of human determination and natural indifference. Their winter was not unique. Thousands of families across the northern plains faced similar challenges every year. The same bone-deep cold, the same desperate need for fuel and food and warmth. Some survived, some did not. The difference often came down to preparation, to knowledge, to the strength of family bonds, to the kind of community support that appeared at Morning Star's Tipi on that February morning with armloads of firewood and food. We do not live that way anymore, most of us. The cold that could have killed this family in hours is kept at bay by insulated walls and central heating, by global supply chains that deliver fuel to our homes without requiring us to gather it ourselves. We sleep in warmth without thinking about warmth, take for granted what our ancestors had to earn every single day. I do not say this to diminish our modern comforts. They are genuine gifts, the accumulated achievements of countless generations who worked and invented and improved so that their descendants could live with less struggle. But there is something we have lost along with the struggle, something that the people in those teepees understood that we have perhaps forgotten. They knew that warmth was not automatic. They knew that survival required effort, knowledge, cooperation. They knew that each person in the family had a role to play and that everyone's contribution mattered. They knew that the community was stronger than any individual and that helping others was not charity but insurance against the day when you would need help yourself. They knew, in short, that they were not alone, that they were part of something larger than themselves, connected to their ancestors who had learned to survive in that harsh land, and to their descendants who would inherit whatever knowledge they managed to preserve and pass on. The teepee was not just a shelter. It was a link in a chain stretching back through countless generations and forward into an uncertain future. Morning Star, tending her fire through that endless night, was not just keeping her own family warm. She was fulfilling a responsibility that extended far beyond the 12-foot circle of her lodge. Every skill she had learned, every technique she applied, every bit of knowledge she would later teach to Brightleaf, all of it was part of a tradition that made human survival possible in places where nature seemed designed to make it impossible. Walks slowly. Singing her prayers in the darkness was not just calling on the spirits for help. She was voicing the accumulated wisdom of her people, the songs and stories and beliefs that gave meaning to the struggle, that transformed mere survival into something richer and more profound. Her voice connected that single difficult night to all the difficult nights that had come before and all those that would come after, and the baby, sleeping warm against her mother's skin, oblivious to the danger surrounding her, was the reason for all of it. The future, the continuation, the living proof that the struggle was worth struggling, that the knowledge was worth preserving, that human life had meaning beyond the boundaries of any individual existence. If you take anything from tonight's journey, I hope it is an appreciation for this simple truth. We are all part of something larger than ourselves. The warmth that surrounds us, wherever it comes from, is a gift from everyone who came before. Everyone who figured out how to survive and passed that knowledge along. And we have a responsibility to those who come after, to preserve what we have learned, to add what we can, to ensure that the chain continues unbroken. But enough of serious thoughts. You came here to rest, not to carry new burdens. The fire has burned down to embers now, and the night outside your window is deep and quiet. Morning Star's family is safe, sleeping soundly after their long ordeal. Spring is coming to the northern plains, bringing warmth and renewal and the possibility of starting again. Let their peace be your peace tonight. Let their warmth wrap around you like a buffalo robe, heavy and soft and comforting. Let the knowledge that they survived, that families always survive when they work together and care for each other, settle into your mind as you drift toward sleep. If you found some comfort in tonight's story, I invite you to subscribe and join our community of night travelers. We gather here several times each week to explore the quiet corners of history, to meet the ordinary people who faced extraordinary challenges, to learn from their struggles and draw strength from their victories. There is always room for one more around the fire. And if you have not yet found sleep, another gentle journey awaits you on your screen. Another chance to lose yourself in the past and find peace in the present. But if you are ready to rest, then rest. The stories will be here tomorrow and the next night and all the nights after that. Close your eyes now. Feel the warmth of your bed, the softness of your pillow, the quiet safety of your room. Remember the family we met tonight, huddled together in their tipi, sharing warmth and strength and love through the longest winter of their lives. Remember that they survived. Remember that you, too, have the strength to face whatever challenges life brings you. The embers fade to gray. The last flicker of firelight disappears. Outside the teepee, the wind has finally gone still, and the stars wheel slowly overhead in their eternal dance. Inside, 7 people sleep the deep sleep of survivors, their breath mingling in the darkness, their body heat creating a pocket of warmth that will carry them through to morning. Morning. Star's hand rests on her husband's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall that tells her he is alive. He is recovering. He will be there beside her when she wakes. Gray Owl sleeps without dreams, his body finally at peace after weeks of struggle. Bright Leaf lies curled around her brother, protecting him as she has learned to protect everyone in her family. Little Hawk's small hand is tangled in his sister's hair. A connection maintained even in sleep, walks slowly, breathes slowly, steadily. The rhythm of an old woman who has seen many winters and expects to see at least one more spring. And the baby, the unnamed little one who will soon receive a name that honors the winter that could not destroy her, sleeps the innocent sleep of the young, dreaming of warmth and milk and the loving faces that surround her. This is how they sleep. This is how they survive. This is how families have always survived, by holding on to each other through the darkness, by sharing what they have, by refusing to let go until the dawn returns. The fire is out now. The night is deep. Sleep well, my friend. May your dreams be warm, and may you wake to find that all the challenges you face are smaller than they seemed in the darkness. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until we meet again, around some other fire, in some other corner of history, rest easy. The winter is over. Spring is coming, and everything is going to be all right.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please subscribe and leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be as peaceful as a calm sea beneath a patient, turning light. Share.